Hello, everyone. This is It's Really Simple with Simeon and Simone, where we put the sim in simple. And we like to ask a lot of the questions that don't get asked. I had somebody recently accuse me of making a reductive, simple response to their very enlightened argument. And I said, thank you. Because yes, sometimes you can reduce things down to simplicity in order to derive your perspective and view on a topic. And we believe that that starts with asking the right questions. Hi, Simone.
Hi.
So today we're going to talk about one of the most inflammatory and controversial topics and truly tragic topics in the Israel-Palestinian conflict today, which is the death toll question. And there's a lot of buzz around this on both sides. I believe there are some questions that haven't been asked that can make this a little bit more clear. And at the end of the day, perhaps it's really simple. So we're going to do that. I want to start by saying that civilian casualties of any kind are tragic. And even if we are a little sarcastic as we're asking some of these questions, the fact that civilians are dying in any conflict, it is a true tragedy. And we aren't happy about that at all. We want it to end. You hear a lot of talk about this, and there's a lot of emotion behind it, and rightfully so. You know, Dave Smith recently made a comment, I have children, and I just want to see the children stop dying. I know what it's like to have children, and I can imagine. And hey, I understand that. I have children too. I've got 3 daughters, and, my youngest daughter, who's 4.5 years old, when an airplane flies overhead, sometimes she gets scared. And that gets me thinking about children that live in war zones and how truly tragic that is. And yet wars happen, and we could get into the whole should wars happen or not. That's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. We're not going to do that right now. But with regard to this particular conflict, it's tragic that all of the loss of life on both sides of this. And we can assign blame for that. But again, that's not what this particular episode is about. So some questions to ask. I want to make one more point, which is this: the casualties in Gaza. How many and who? It's my opinion that nobody knows yet. What do you think, Simone?
Well, we only have one source to go off of, and that is a terrorist organization.
Yeah, they're the primary source, but there are 2 sources that are citing numbers. One is Israel, one is the Gaza Health Ministry, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And some of the arguments you're hearing are that how could Israel know how many combatants, because they're estimating the number of combatant casualties, but they don't know the number of civilian casualties. And so, of course, one of the questions you're hearing, well, how could they possibly know the number of combatant casualties if they don't know the number of civilian casualties? And the truth of the matter is, I don't think anyone knows, and I don't think anyone can know right now. It is the job of a military to try to make an assessment like that, as it is the job of what would be an official health ministry to try to make those assessments. But at this point, I would question any numbers that are coming out on this. And I think that actually is a really important point. People are so quick to cite these numbers, especially you mainstream media outlets. You're so quick to cite the numbers when really we cannot know those numbers. And I would just challenge you that with regard to good reporting, you should wait, because the numbers that you're citing have an effect on the way people perceive things, and you cannot know, let alone the forces on the ground on both sides of this conflict. All that being said, let's start to get into some of the questions. So the first question that I want to ask, and we'll try to make these yes or no questions, and I would ask those of you that are listening to this to research for yourself and try to answer these quote unquote yes or no questions for yourself. So
Can I
number
answer,
one
or do you want me to wait?
Yeah, Simone, why don't you answer the questions? Okay, with your opinion, which may be slightly biased. Who knows? We do a lot of research to try to figure out what's going on. So, and I don't think we do it in a biased way. We really want to know what's happening. So question number 1, does Hamas have a human casualty strategy in place?
Yes.
Okay. And a human casualty strategy would simply mean it's a strategic initiative, if you would. They have a strategy whereby they benefit from civilian casualties in Gaza. And some of the questions you may want to ask in even trying to determine if Hamas has a human casualty strategy in place, here are the questions I would ask. Has Hamas openly made any statements that seem to indicate their willingness for Palestinian civilians to become casualties in this conflict?
i.e.,
Simone?
as a martyr, perhaps?
Yes. Or even just simple statements like, we don't care if 100,000 have to die for this cause, so be it. So I encourage some of you to just look up the statements that Hamas has made, just their statements, not what they do. We'll talk about that too, but look up what they're saying in order to determine if they have a human casualty strategy in place. Some other questions you might ask are, do they seem to demonstrate proper leadership with regard to protecting and caring for the citizens of Gaza?
No.
Distribution of aid,
Yeah.
etc.
I don't think I've seen any pictures or videos of Hamas actually handing out aid ever. Have you?
I not that I'm aware of, but I'm told that they do hijack all of the aid and sell it.
Right. I've seen them on top of trucks, like with their guns, driving around taking aid, but I don't think I've ever actually seen them, like standing in a line handing out boxes of aid.
Is Hamas concerned with the general well-being of the civilians of Gaza? And one of those questions does regard aid and the distribution of aid, but how about, do they truly protect the civilians of Gaza? Are the civilians of Gaza allowed in the tunnel infrastructure that Hamas combatants hide in? Go ahead, Simone.
No.
Civilians are not allowed in the tunnels that Hamas hides in. So you can answer those questions for yourself, but does Hamas have a human casualty strategy in place based on what they say, based on what they do, based on their treatment of the civilian population in Gaza?
And let's not forget how much money the tunnel system cost to build and has cost them over, decades.
That's a whole other question. But it
I'm
is a
just saying.
good question with regard to determining whether they have the well-being of the citizens of Gaza in place, what they could have done with that money and so much other money that they're spending to militarize this entire region. Question number 2. Is martyrdom praised and celebrated amongst the population of Gaza?
Of course.
So that's a yes. Is martyrdom praised, celebrated, and even, one might ask or contend, a goal of radicalized factions which make up an estimated at least 50% of Gaza? Is martyrdom praised and a goal of civilian population in Gaza?
Isn't that part of their religion?
We'll let the audience answer that. And some of the ways that you could go about answering that would be to look at what they say, look at their charters, and just ask, why don't you just ask ChatGPT? But so I would say the answer is yes. Martyrdom is praised and in some cases a goal. Next question. Who is reporting the casualty numbers coming out of Gaza? The Gaza
Hamas.
Health Ministry, right? Who?
Hamas. Yeah.
Through the Gaza Health Ministry, but who runs the Gaza Health Ministry, Simone?
Hamas.
Is Hamas responsible? Yes or no?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't think that one's questionable. I think everyone knows that. But if not, look it up. Is Hamas a credible source for reporting on numbers of any kind? What is it?
It's clearly no.
Why not?
For example, just look at what they did most recently with the hostage exchange in regard to the Beavis family, the games that they played and how they told your family is dead, your family is alive. And then they, just the games that they play, and they lied to the public. They lied to the families. I mean, how could you trust these people?
Okay, so Hamas is not a credible source. You cannot trust Hamas. And I would say this is a two-edged sword. This was an argument that was leveled against Natasha Hausdorff in the now infamous Piers Morgan interview where he wouldn't let her speak. And it's not a bad point made by Dave Smith and Piers that, well, if Hamas has no credibility, why are you, when they retracted their numbers, because of course the numbers are so easily debunked, and eventually Hamas retracted their own numbers and admitted what they thought was the civilian to combatant ratio. And Israel was saying, see, even Hamas admits that this is the civilian to combatant casualty ratio. I agree that Israel shouldn't be lauding that as any kind of success, because who cares? We'll talk about this in another episode. Who cares what sources that are not credible have to say. One way or the other, we shouldn't be quoting them, because if you quote them on one end and give them credit, then maybe you should give them credit on another end too. So you can't credit numbers when they work in your favor and then discredit them when they do not. So my point with that is, I don't think anyone should be making an assessment on this yet. Let's work with what we know, okay, to be true, to the best of our ability. So is Hamas a credible source of information?
No.
Okay. Here's a very, very challenging question that I have never heard anyone ask yet. Is it possible that both numbers are true? Before you answer that question, let me ask a couple other questions to lead up to that question. Is hatred and violence and radicalism systematically taught through the education system in Gaza?
Yes, by UNRWA.
Not supposed to name names.
Sorry. Why not?
But you can research it, and we'll go ahead and name them. You can research it, and we'll plop a website here where you can check that out for yourself. But the answer is yes. Hatred, violence, and radicalism is taught systematically through the education system in Gaza, which leads to the next question. Does that lead to radicalization? Yes, that does lead.
Clearly.
That leads to radicalization. Which leads to the next question, which is a hard question. Is it highly likely that there are underage combatants involved in this conflict in Gaza?
Highly likely.
It's highly likely because of the systematic teaching and indoctrination of hatred and violence and radicalism. It's highly likely that there are underage combatants. I've never heard anyone talk about this, and I don't know why. And it probably because it's such an unpleasant thing to talk about. But if it's the reality, let's talk about it. Therefore, it leads to this greater question. Could both of the numbers be true at the same time with regard to human casualties and children casualties? Is it possible that numbers that are being counted on the Gaza side as children have some accuracy, but those numbers are also being counted accurately by Israel as combatant casualties because they are underage casualties? And nobody likes to think about that. For those of you that want to ask the questions and get to the truth, why don't you just look at imagery coming out of Gaza regarding the militarization of minors, even toddlers? The militarization of minors is, in my opinion, one of the greatest forms of child abuse the planet has ever known. And it's not just because of trauma inflicted upon the child, but it's instilling in a child a value system to inflict trauma on others. And that is one of the greatest forms of child abuse imaginable. And does it take place in Gaza? And if you don't know the answer to that, why don't you do some research and find out? So in lieu of all these things, let's ask some other questions. Let me run through these real quick. Does Hamas have a human casualty strategy in place?
Yes.
Is martyrdom taught and praised and even a goal within a significant portion of Gazan society based on what we observe?
Yes.
Is Hamas responsible for the casualty numbers coming out of Gaza?
Yes.
Being reported. Is Hamas a credible source for any form of reporting?
No.
Is there freedom of speech or freedom of press in Gaza?
Oh, no. You can try, but you will. I mean, we've seen what happens when you speak out against Hamas.
So the answer is really simple. No, there is no freedom of press or speech. Is it possible that there's truth in both numbers because of the high likelihood of there being underage combatants in Gaza?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the sad one. Well, they're all sad. That's horribly sad. Okay, so let's break this down a little further, okay? None of this can be known concretely. I know what the estimates are based on both sides, and they're probably somewhere in the middle. There are somewhere between 30 to 50,000 casualties on the Gaza side of this war, out of a population of around 2.1 to 2.2 million people, which would be somewhere around 1% to 3.5% estimate of the Gaza population. Simultaneously, the estimates of civilian infrastructure that's been destroyed in Gaza range between 50 to 70%. So that's civilian homes, roads, in some cases schools and hospitals, has been destroyed. And the reason for that is because there are 500 kilometers of tunnels that are built underneath the civilian infrastructure in Gaza, from which Hamas is fighting. Okay. And, again, for Dave Smith, who doesn't seem to understand how tunnels work, tunnels are linear structures that are built underneath the ground, Dave, that go in lines. And so when you say, well, I've seen the streets of Gaza and home after home after home is just destroyed, well, that's because in order to destroy a tunnel and 500 kilometers of tunnels that are built underneath civilian infrastructure, you have to
what's in
destroy
the
it
tunnels?
in lines. What I'd like to pose as a question is, what lengths would a military have to go to destroy an estimated 50 to 70% of civilian infrastructure, but only have a human casualty rate of somewhere between 1 to 3%?
Which military is responsible for the movement of said civilians throughout this war?
That's a good question. We know that Israel drops leaflets and sends texts and calls cell phones to try to let people know to evacuate regions. And there have been some cases where people on the ground have said that some of those regions have still been attacked. And of course, Israel says if that is the case, it's because combatants moved into those regions and they had intel on it. I can't comment on any of that because I don't know. I do know that, having served in the IDF, I do know that Israel does warn civilian populations before they're going to act in a region. And I would say, based on the numbers, Simone, that it's been largely successful because they've destroyed somewhere between 50 to 70% of civilian infrastructure with a casualty rate that remains around 1 to 3%. If civilians had been inhabiting all of those residences, all of those homes, had been walking all of those city streets while that destruction was taking place, can we imagine what the death toll could have been or would have been?
Yeah, I have yet to see any evidence supporting the fact that Hamas is the one evacuating, clearing out these buildings and trying to protect their civilians.
Well,
It's not happening.
there's no evidence that I've ever seen that indicates in any way that Hamas warns people or tries to move people from region to region in order to protect them. And in fact, we can fall back on our initial question, which is, does Hamas have a human casualty strategy in place? And we know that they do. The answer to that is yes. So why would they move civilians out of harm's way? So it's Israel that's trying to move civilians out of harm's way, and seemingly, based on the numbers, doing it in a very effective way. We do know that just because somebody receives a leaflet or a text or a phone call warning that there's going to be operations carried out in their region, they still have a decision to make. Some people decide not to leave. That's true. And that's understandable. I can understand that. I wouldn't want to leave my home. But obviously, it's been very effective to have such a low percentage of casualties with such a high rate of destruction.
I believe it's one of the lowest in all of the urban wars. Usually the civilian casualty rate, or whatever, we can't tell what's what, but usually it's very high in
Yep,
an
it's much
urban
higher.
war
Historically,
zone.
it's been much higher, unquestionably. Also, historically, there has never been a war that's as scrutinized by this war in this tiny place on this on the map, and that leads to a whole nother slew of questions that people should be asking. But let's just stop here and let people consider what's taking place on the ground in Gaza, and you can form your own thoughts based on it from there.
Happy thinking.